People think the scariest moments in life are loud, but they are wrong. The scariest moments are quiet, so quiet that your own breath sounds too bright in the room. That morning, at the first light of dawn, I walked into my kitchen and stopped like someone had pulled a string inside my chest. A black briefcase sat on the table, half open, like a mouth ready to speak. It had been locked for 17 years, and somehow, without my touch, its lid had lifted during the night. My name is Evelyn Hart, and I was 62 years old on the day my life split into a before and an after. The light in the kitchen was soft, almost gentle, but nothing inside me felt calm. I stood there barefoot, feeling the cold tiles under my feet while my eyes stayed fixed on the briefcase. It looked harmless in the early morning glow, but something heavy pressed inside my chest. I could not explain it then, but I already knew that whatever was inside that case was not meant to stay hidden forever. I heard sirens far away, moving fast through the morning quiet. They did not belong to our street, yet they felt strangely in rhythm with the moment, as if the world was whispering that something had finally reached me. The sound faded, and I was left alone again with the briefcase and a rising feeling I had ignored for years without knowing why. Robert, my husband, had left the house the night before after a phone call he took near the back door. He spoke quietly, almost whispering, as if someone might hear him even though we lived alone. When I asked who it was, he said it was work. That was always his answer. But something about the way he avoided my eyes told me it was not the truth. And when he walked out without taking the briefcase, I knew something was very wrong. I did not open it right away. I sat at the table first, keeping my hands on my lap like a child waiting for permission. The briefcase looked ordinary: black leather, worn edges, metal locks scratched from years of use. But Robert guarded it with a seriousness I never understood. He kept it close during trips, dinners, even funerals. He never let anyone touch it, not even me. And now it sat open, like it had been waiting for this moment. I leaned forward and touched the lid gently. The metal felt cold, colder than the room. Inside, I saw papers stacked in careful piles and an envelope pushed to the side. My name was written on it, but not the name I had used for years. It said Evelyn Price, my maiden name, the name I stopped hearing the day I married Robert. Seeing it again felt like hearing a voice from the past call out to me. I looked away because my eyes suddenly stung. I felt the room shift around me, as if the walls were listening. I tried to steady my breath, but something inside me had already begun to open like a cracked shell. The envelope was thin, but it felt heavy, as if 17 years of silence were pressed inside it. I reached out, then pulled my hand back. I was not ready. Not yet. Some truths feel safer when they remain folded shut. I thought about the stranger who called last night. Her voice was soft but shaking. She said only one thing before hanging up. "Look inside the briefcase before it's too late." I replayed her words now, letting them move through the room like cold air. Who was she? How did she know about the briefcase? And why did her voice sound afraid of Robert? And afraid for me? None of it made sense. The sky outside was getting brighter, but the house felt darker by the second. I stood from the chair and walked to the window, hoping the morning light would calm me. It did not. My hands were shaking, and my breath felt thin. I looked back at the briefcase. After 17 years of silence, it had opened itself, like a question I could no longer avoid. And I knew this was only the beginning. If you had asked me yesterday who my husband was, I would have smiled and given you the same answer I had given for years. But today, standing in that kitchen with the briefcase open and the dawn creeping in, I understood something painful and clear. I had been living beside a stranger. And whatever I found inside that briefcase was going to show me a truth
I had been blind to for far too long.
I stood there longer than I want to admit, trying to gather enough courage to lift the papers and face whatever waited for me. The quiet in the house felt different now, heavy and expectant, as if the walls were holding their breath. I thought about all the years I had chosen not to question things, the moments when my heart felt uneasy, but I pushed the feeling aside. Maybe I believed peace was more important than truth. Maybe I believed love required silence. But standing there that morning, I understood that silence can also be dangerous. It can hide things you imagined you would face. And now, the truth was sitting in front of me quietly. Before all of this happened, my life looked very different. It was slower, softer, and shaped by small routines that felt safe. When I look back now, I almost envy the woman I used to be, quiet, trusting, and unaware of how fragile her peace really was. I didn't know that the little cracks in my life had been forming for years. Back then, I believed I understood my marriage, my home, and the man I shared both with. I see now that I understood only the surface. Every morning used to begin with the garden. I would step outside with my cup of tea and breathe in the cool air. The soil always smelled rich at that hour, almost sweet. I planted herbs near the back fence, basil, rosemary, mint. I took care of them like they were friends who needed gentle attention. Sometimes the wind carried the scent into the kitchen, and Robert would smile and say the house smelled fresh. Those were the mornings when I believed he loved the small life we had made. After gardening, I usually spent an hour shaping clay in my small pottery shed. It was my place, the only space in the house that felt like it belonged fully to me. The steady movement of my hands smoothing the wet clay always calmed my thoughts. The women who attended my part-time pottery classes often told me they came not for the pottery, but for the peace. I never told them that I taught for the same reason, to feel steady, to feel held, to feel like each shape I created gave me a place to belong. Every day at 6 o'clock I cooked dinner. Nothing special, simple soups, roasted vegetables, chicken, rice. Robert liked routines. He said they kept life predictable. When he came home on time, we ate together quietly. He would ask about my day, and I would ask about his. His answers were always short but polite. He was not cruel. He was not unkind. He was simply distant, like a man standing behind a thin glass wall, trying to look present without ever stepping fully into the room. But there was one thing that never fit into our calm routines: the briefcase. It was always with him, not sometimes, always. A black leather case with tarnished silver locks, worn at the edges from years of being carried. He never left it behind. He brought it to the grocery store, to family dinners, on vacations, even to the hospital when he once had a minor surgery. Nurses asked him what was inside. He only said it contained important documents. But I lived with him long enough to know it was more than that. He kept it close even during moments when it made no sense. I remember our 10th anniversary dinner. We had gone to a small restaurant by the lake. The lights were soft, the water outside shimmered like glass, and the waiter brought candles to our table. It should have felt romantic. But Robert placed the briefcase against his leg under the table, his hand resting on it the entire time. When I asked him why he couldn't leave it at home for one night, he smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "It just gives me peace of mind," he said. The conversation ended there, because I didn't want to ruin the evening. I wish I had pushed more. But back then, I had a habit of choosing peace over discomfort. I loved calm moments. I feared conflict. And I believed that trusting your husband meant not asking questions that made him uncomfortable. I know now that silence can be its own kind of danger. Still, our life looked normal from the outside. Friends said we seemed steady. Neighbors thought we were one of those quiet, long-married couples who understood each other without words. Maybe in some ways we did. Robert understood that I would not press him. I understood that he preferred order and routine. That was enough for a long time. But there was an emptiness to our life, a softness without warmth. It felt like living in a house where the lights were always dim. We didn't fight, but we didn't laugh much either. We didn't fall apart, but we didn't grow together. We simply moved through the years side by side, connected by habit instead of closeness. Looking back, I think part of me sensed something was missing. There were moments when I looked at him and felt a small flicker of distance, as if he were thinking about a place I had never been or someone I had never met. But whenever I asked if something was wrong, he would place a hand on my shoulder and say everything was fine. His voice was calm, his eyes were calm. His answers were always enough to make me quiet again. I used to believe that was love, that steady, peaceful feeling that didn't ask for too much. I told myself that marriages changed, that passion faded, that comfort was enough. But comfort can be a quiet way of losing yourself, piece by piece, without noticing the gaps. And yet, despite everything, I stayed. I stayed because the life we built felt familiar. I stayed because the idea of starting over at my age felt heavy. I stayed because most days were easy, even if they weren't full. And I stayed because the briefcase, though strange, never gave me a clear reason to fear him. Now I know that strange things do not always announce themselves loudly. Some of the most dangerous truths hide behind the softest routines. Some lies can live peacefully for years before choosing their moment to rise. Back then, before the night the briefcase opened, I thought my life was simple and safe. I thought I knew who Robert was. I thought 17 years of togetherness meant something solid. I was wrong. And what waited inside that briefcase would show me just how wrong I truly was. In the weeks before everything changed, life inside our house began to feel different. It was not loud or dramatic. It was subtle, like a draft coming from a window you thought was closed. Something quiet had shifted, and even though I could not name it, I felt it in small ways that settled uneasily under my skin. I remember telling myself not to overthink, but the truth is, my heart had already noticed what my mind was trying to ignore. The changes began with Robert's late-night phone calls. He had taken calls at odd hours before, but these were different. He spoke in a softer voice, almost a whisper, as if he was trying to make the conversation disappear into the darkness. Sometimes I would wake up to the sound of his footsteps leaving the bedroom. I could hear the floor creak softly under his weight. When I listened closely, I could hear him speaking from the living room, but I could never make out the words. Whenever I walked toward him, the talking stopped before I reached the doorway. There were also sudden trips he claimed were for work. He never gave details, but before he at least tried to explain. Now he only said, "I won't be long," and took the briefcase with him like it was attached to his arm. He returned tired, guarded, and quieter than usual. I would ask how the trip went, and he would smile the small smile he used when he wanted to avoid a conversation. "It was fine," he always said. "Nothing more, nothing less." After a while I stopped asking because I could feel the wall between us growing heavier with each attempt. But what I remember most clearly is the moment I heard my maiden name, my old name, spoken in Robert's voice late one night. I had gotten up for water. The house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator. As I walked past his office door, I heard him say my full maiden name, Evelyn Price. I froze where I stood. Almost no one used that name anymore. Hearing it felt like hearing a ghost whisper in the hallway. Before I could move, he added a sentence that made my stomach tighten. "She can't ever know." His voice was sharp, urgent, and then it went quiet. I stood there breathing slowly, listening to the silence press against the walls. For a moment I thought about knocking, about asking what he meant. But something in me held back. The tone in his voice did not sound like a husband talking about his wife. It sounded like a man protecting something he hoped would stay hidden. I returned to bed, but sleep did not come. I stared at the ceiling and listened to the quiet house settle around me. Each small sound felt louder, like the room was reminding me that secrets can live peacefully beside you for years before choosing to speak. Over the next days, I began noticing even smaller things. When I entered a room unexpectedly, Robert sometimes jumped a little, as if I had caught him doing something he didn't want me to see. Once I found him standing in the hallway holding the briefcase tightly against his chest. He looked startled, then immediately set it down on a chair, as if nothing unusual had happened. Another time, he left his phone face down on the table and kept glancing at it with a nervous tension I had never seen before. Every time it buzzed, he took a deep breath before checking the screen. My sister came to visit one afternoon. She watched me for a few minutes while we drank tea, and then asked gently, "Evie, are you all right? You look tired." I wanted to tell her everything I had noticed, the whispers, the late-night calls, the unfinished explanations. But the words felt strange in my mouth. Speaking them out loud made the fear feel more real, and I didn't want to believe something was wrong. So I told her I was fine, just not sleeping well. She didn't look convinced, and her worried eyes stayed with me long after she left. Even my friends noticed something in my voice during our pottery classes. I was teaching the same way, saying the same words, shaping clay the same way I always had, but they felt something different. One of them asked if Robert was doing okay. When I asked why, she said, "You've been quiet these last few days, quieter than usual." I didn't know how to answer her. The house itself felt different too. The rooms had always been calm, but now they felt heavy. The silence that used to comfort me now seemed to watch me. I found myself listening more carefully when Robert moved around. I waited for the phone to ring. I watched his eyes when he spoke, trying to catch something real behind his calm expressions. It was exhausting, like living with a puzzle I did not know how to solve. But the moment that changed everything came one Saturday afternoon. Robert had stepped outside to take a call. I was in the living room passing by the window when I saw him standing in the yard with his back to me. His shoulders were tense, and he kept turning the briefcase in his hand like he was trying to steady himself. When he ended the call, he looked around slowly, as if checking whether someone had been watching. Then he pressed his hand against his forehead and sighed in a way I had never heard from him, long, shaky, tired. I stepped back from the window before he turned. That was when I knew something deeper was happening, something I was not part of, something he did not want me to see. And though I still tried to calm myself, telling my mind it was nothing, my heart knew the truth was getting closer. I didn't know it yet, but the briefcase would soon show me everything he had tried so hard to hide. Robert collapsed on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day that should have disappeared into the background of our lives. The sky was clear, the air was mild, and I was standing at the kitchen sink rinsing a mug when I heard a strange, broken sound from the driveway. It was not a shout, not a cry, more like a breath cut in half. I set the mug down and wiped my hands without thinking. My heart started beating faster before my mind even understood why. When I opened the front door, I saw him on the ground beside the car. One of his hands was pressed against his chest, the other reaching blindly toward the open back seat. The briefcase lay there, half on the seat and half hanging out, like it had tried to fall with him. His face was pale, his lips slightly parted, and his eyes were wide with a fear I had never seen in him before. "Robert?" My voice sounded thin, almost childlike. I knelt beside him, my knees scraping the concrete, and grabbed his hand. It was cold and shaking. He tried to speak, but only a ragged whisper came out, a broken piece of my name that never fully formed. I shouted for help then, the sound tearing out of me in a way that felt unreal, like I was watching another woman from far away. The ambulance arrived faster than I expected. The sirens that had once felt distant were now right in front of our home, loud and sharp. Neighbors peeked through curtains and from porches. I barely saw them. All I could focus on was the way the paramedics lifted Robert onto the stretcher, the way his eyes rolled toward the house for a second, like he was looking for something he could not reach. As they pushed him toward the ambulance, his gaze flicked to the car, to the back seat, to the briefcase. "Wait," I said, stepping toward it. One of the paramedics shook his head gently. "We need to move now," he said. "You can bring his things later." The back door of the ambulance shut with a hollow thud. I watched it pull away, its lights painting red and white streaks across the street. My chest felt tight, but somewhere under the fear, another feeling began to rise, something I didn't want to name. I turned back to the car. The briefcase was still there, tilted, the handle just within my reach. I picked it up. It felt heavier than ever. For a moment I stood in the driveway holding it, feeling like I was touching something that did not belong to me, even though it had lived in my house for 17 years. My hands trembled, but I brought it inside and set it on the kitchen counter. I told myself I was only keeping it safe for him. That was all, nothing more. At the hospital the lights were too bright, and the hallways too white. The smell of disinfectant clung to the air, mixing with the quiet murmur of voices and the distant beeping of machines. A nurse led me to a small waiting area. I sat there, hands folded, staring at the floor. Time lost its shape. Minutes felt like hours, hours like days. Every time a door opened, my heart jumped. A doctor finally came to speak with me. His voice was calm but serious. Words like cardiac event, observation, and critical floated in the air around me. I nodded because that was what people did when doctors spoke, even when their minds had slipped somewhere else. All I could think about was how fast everything had changed from one ordinary moment to the next. Later that night, a woman approached me while I sat alone in a plastic chair. She wore a badge that said social worker, but it was her eyes that caught me. They were kind, but there was something behind them, something like recognition. "Mrs. Hart?" she asked softly. "Yes," my voice sounded tired. She sat down beside me, folding her hands in her lap. "If anything happens," she said slowly, choosing her words with care, "you should check the date on the envelope." I frowned. "What envelope?" She hesitated. For a second, I thought she might take the words back, but then she sighed as if she had decided something. "You'll understand when you see it," she said. "Just remember the date." Then she rose and walked away before I could ask anything else. I watched her go, feeling as if the floor beneath me had tilted again. When I returned home that night, the house felt colder than the hospital. The briefcase sat exactly where I had left it, on the kitchen counter, like a patient thing waiting for me. The quiet around it was thick. I walked toward it slowly, each step sounding too loud on the tile. There was no one here to stop me now. No husband watching. No excuse about important documents. No small smile pushing away my questions. Up close, I saw something I had not noticed before. One of the metal locks was cracked, the surface bent like someone had forced it open. My breath caught. I touched it with my fingertip. The metal was rough and a little sharp. Someone had tried to open this in a hurry. Maybe at the hospital. Maybe before. I didn't know. All I knew was that the lock that had kept me out for 17 years was no longer whole. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I wrapped both hands around the briefcase and slowly lifted the lid. It opened with a stiff, tired sound, like an old door that had not been moved in a long time. The smell inside was faint but dusty, like paper that had been kept in the dark for years. Stacks of documents lay inside, neatly arranged. Some were bound with thin strings, others clipped together. There were photographs too, their edges worn. But what caught my eye first was a folder thicker than the rest. It was marked with my maiden name. Not Hart. Price. Seeing it written there made my hands go weak. I reached out and brushed the edge of the folder, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. There was also an envelope tucked near the back, sealed and slightly yellowed. My maiden name was written on it as well, in the same tight handwriting. Underneath my name there was a date, the day before our wedding. My throat felt dry. The social worker's words echoed in my mind. "Check the date on the envelope." I did not open it, not yet. I stared at it, feeling as if the room were closing in around me. Whatever lay inside that envelope had been waiting 17 years to reach me. I knew with a kind of painful certainty that once I read it, I would never see my life, or my husband, the same way again. I closed the briefcase halfway and stepped back, pressing my hand against the counter to steady myself. Tears burned behind my eyes, but they did not fall. My thoughts ran in circles. Why had he kept a file on me? Why was my old name written inside something I was never meant to see? And what kind of husband carried a sealed envelope for 17 years and never handed it to his wife? I pictured Robert in the hospital bed, surrounded by walls and machines, future hanging by threads. For years I had trusted him. Now in the kitchen, I was afraid of my blindness more than of whatever waited inside that envelope. The house felt too quiet after I closed the briefcase. It wasn't the calm, peaceful kind of quiet I used to enjoy. It was a heavy silence, the kind that sits in a room like a shadow with its own weight. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment, trying to steady my breathing. My fingers still tingled from touching the file with my maiden name. My chest felt tight, as if something inside me had cracked and the pieces were slowly shifting out of place. I walked into the living room and sat on the edge of the couch. The cushions dipped beneath me, familiar but strangely foreign. My eyes drifted around the room. Everything looked the same. Same curtains, same pictures on the wall, same soft lamp near the window. But nothing felt the same. Every memory that used to live in this room suddenly felt shaky, as if I wasn't sure what parts were real and what parts had been built on a lie. I looked at the framed photo on the shelf, the one from our 15th anniversary. Robert had his arm around me, smiling politely. I remembered thinking that night felt a little hollow, like the two of us were performing a version of happiness instead of living it. I had pushed the feeling away back then, telling myself marriages change. People change. Maybe the quiet between us was just part of getting older. I didn't realize I was comforting myself with soft excuses. My eyes moved to the briefcase in the kitchen doorway. I could still see the cracked lock. For 17 years, I accepted that briefcase as part of our life. I never questioned it. I told myself a good wife respects boundaries. But now, looking back, I wondered if he had counted on that. If he had known I would never open it, never ask, never imagine that something so important could be hidden so close. The questions began to rise in me like a storm tide. Why did he have a file with my old name? Who wrote the envelope? Why that date? Why carry it through every year of our marriage? Why guard it like his life depended on it? Every question felt like a needle pricking at parts of me I didn't want touched. I pressed my hand to my forehead and tried to breathe slowly. Memories came back sharper than before. Moments I had ignored, small ones, simple ones, returned with a new, painful clarity. The business trips that came with no details. The times he returned home late, eyes tired but distant. The way he pulled the briefcase closer whenever someone approached. The way he changed the subject whenever I asked about his work. The nights he sat up after I went to bed, the glow of his phone lighting his face while he leaned over the briefcase like it was part of him. I realized I had lived with signs for years, but I had pushed them aside because I did not want to see what they might mean. It hurt to admit that to myself. It hurt even more to realize how deeply he had trusted my silence. I stood up and began walking around the house without really thinking. I walked into the hallway, touching the wall as I passed. I walked into the bedroom, where the faint smell of Robert's cologne still clung to the air. His slippers sat neatly by the bed. His glasses were on the nightstand. His shirt from the day before lay folded on a chair. These small signs of his life felt strangely delicate, as if touching them might break something fragile. "How much did I miss?" I whispered to the empty room. My voice sounded small. I walked to his side of the bed and sat down slowly. My fingers brushed the blanket, the one we had shared for years. I remembered nights when I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, wondering why I felt alone even when we were inches apart. I had blamed myself. I had blamed aging. I had blamed life. I had blamed everything except the possibility that he was keeping something from me. My phone buzzed suddenly, startling me. It was a nurse from the hospital. "Mrs. Hart," she said gently, "your husband is unconscious. His condition is serious. You should come when you can." Her words settled over me like cold water. I thanked her and ended the call, but I didn't move right away. I stared at the phone in my hand, feeling the heaviness of the moment pull me deeper into my thoughts. For 17 years I had lived beside a man who never fully let me in, and now he lay in a hospital bed, and I was the one left holding pieces of a truth I didn't understand. I walked back to the kitchen. The briefcase waited for me like a dark promise. I reached for the envelope again, the one with my maiden name written in tight, careful handwriting. My hand hovered above it. I wanted to open it. I wanted answers. I wanted to end this confusion, this ache, this fear rising inside me. But another part of me held back. I wasn't ready to face whatever waited inside those folded pages. I slid the envelope back into the briefcase and closed the lid halfway. My hands were shaking, my throat felt tight, the room felt too small. I grabbed my coat and purse and headed toward the door. Before stepping outside, I turned back one more time. The briefcase sat on the table, silent, but alive with everything I didn't know. My heart pulled toward it, and away from it at the same time. At the hospital, I parked and sat in the car with the engine off. The silence felt deep, almost thick. My hands gripped the steering wheel. I took the envelope out of my purse. I hadn't meant to bring it, but there it was, lying quietly against my palm. For a long moment I stared at it. The writing looked older up close, the ink slightly faded but still clear. I felt my heartbeat in my fingertips. I slid a finger under the seal. My breath held itself. When I opened it and read the first lines, the words punched the air out of my lungs. My eyes blurred. My whole body felt cold, as if the world had shifted under my feet. I sank back into the seat and whispered, "I never knew him at all." The truth had finally reached me, and nothing in my life would ever look the same again. The hours after I read the letter felt strange, almost unreal, like walking through a dream where the rooms looked familiar but carried a different weight. I moved slowly, not because I was weak, but because my thoughts had become heavier than my steps. The shock was still inside me, sharp and alive, but something else was forming underneath it, something steadier, something clearer. I could feel a quiet strength beginning to rise, almost like the ground under my feet was becoming solid again after a long, trembling night. I sat in my car outside the hospital for a long time. People walked past, nurses hurried across the pavement, cars came and left, but none of it reached me. I was wrapped in a stillness that felt new, almost protective. The letter lay folded beside me, its words still burning in my mind. I didn't read it a second time. I didn't need to. The meaning had already rooted itself inside me. I finally stepped out of the car when I felt my heartbeat settle. Inside the hospital, the lights were still too bright, but I walked differently now. My hands were no longer shaking. My breath was slow. Grief was still there, but it no longer ruled me. It sat beside me instead, quiet, waiting. When I entered Robert's room, he looked small in the bed, smaller than I had ever seen him. Machines beeped softly around him. His chest rose and fell with effort. His eyes were closed, and for a moment I simply stood there, watching him breathe. This was the man I had trusted for 17 years. The man who had carried a secret life inside a briefcase, while I folded his shirts and cooked his dinners. The man who had held my hand on long walks, but never offered me the truth. I felt the familiar ache in my chest, but it was softer now, less sharp, almost like an old bruise. A nurse adjusted one of the monitors and stepped back. "He's stable for now," she said gently. "We'll keep watching him." I nodded. "Thank you." She hesitated for a moment. "You look calmer today." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "I think I finally understand what I'm facing," I said simply. She gave me a thoughtful look, then left the room quietly. I sat in the chair beside his bed and folded my hands. There was so much I wanted to ask him, so much I wanted to hear from his own lips. But the truth was, even if he woke and spoke perfectly, I wasn't sure his answers would matter anymore. The facts in the briefcase and the words in the letter had already done their work. They had opened a door inside me that I could never close again. After a few minutes, I leaned forward and touched the blanket near his hand. "I loved you," I whispered, "and you hid everything from me." Saying it out loud felt both painful and freeing. It was like releasing a truth I had carried too tightly. I left the hospital with a steady step, not fast, not slow, just sure. The night air felt cool on my skin. The city lights glowed softly in the distance, and for the first time since this began, I felt something that surprised me. Control. Not over him, not over the past, but over myself. Over what I would choose to do next. When I reached home, the house greeted me with silence again, but it didn't scare me this time. I turned on a single lamp in the living room, letting its warm light soften the shadows. The briefcase sat on the table where I had left it, closed but not locked. I walked toward it slowly, like approaching an old enemy or an old truth, I wasn't sure which. This time I didn't hesitate. I lifted the lid again. The papers inside looked the same, but I didn't. My fear had shifted into focus. I could see the path ahead in a way I hadn't before. I didn't touch the letter or the envelope. They had already done their part. Instead, I began looking through everything else. I didn't understand many of the documents. Some had strange numbers, strange names, strange company stamps. Some looked like financial papers. Some looked like letters exchanged between people I had never met. Some files had been printed years ago, others more recent. The more I looked, the more I realized how much time and care he had put into keeping this secret life separate from the one he lived with me. But what struck me most was the consistency, the dates, the patterns, the names repeating quietly in the background of his life, like a song I had never heard. One name in particular showed up again and again. I didn't know who the person was, but every time I saw it, something in my stomach tightened. It was clear they were important to him, to the documents, to everything he had been protecting. And maybe even to me. I took out a notebook from the drawer and began writing down details, dates, locations, signatures, amounts. My handwriting shook at first, but after a few lines it steadied. I was no longer the woman who looked away. I was the woman who was finally ready to see. As I worked, I realized I had spent 17 years trying not to disturb the quiet of my home. Now I was disturbing it with purpose. Every paper I read pushed me deeper into a truth he had tried to hide. Every note I wrote felt like taking a step toward myself. I didn't know where this path would lead. I didn't know what I would learn, or what I would become through it. But I knew one thing with complete certainty. I would not let myself stay blind. Not anymore. Around midnight, I sat back and looked at the papers spread across the table. I felt tired, but it wasn't the tiredness of defeat. It was the tiredness of someone who had carried too much for too long and had finally decided to put it down. I closed the briefcase gently, not with fear now, but with intention. I will find out the whole truth, I said quietly to the empty room, not out of anger, not out of hate, but because I deserve to know. For the first time since this began, I felt a quiet, powerful calm settling through me, like the first breath after a storm. I knew what I had to do next. Evelyn's transformation began quietly, not with shouting or anger, but with a calm kind of strength she had never felt before. She woke the next morning with a clearer mind than she expected. The pain from the envelope still pulsed inside her, but it no longer controlled her. It felt like a wound that had stopped bleeding, still tender, still painful, but no longer draining her. She stood in her kitchen, looking at the briefcase on the table. The morning light touched the leather gently, making the cracked lock shine. It looked different now, less like an object and more like a doorway. A doorway she had already stepped through. She made herself a cup of tea, her movements slow and steady, and then sat at the table with a notebook beside her. It was time to move with intention. She was done being confused. She was done being scared. She opened the briefcase again, this time without hesitation. She took out the documents, spreading them across the table. Some were financial papers, with long numbers she didn't fully understand. Some were letters exchanged between people she didn't know. But she didn't need to understand everything yet. She only needed to find a starting point. And she found one. A letter with a company name she recognized faintly. A law firm. She wrote the firm's name in her notebook, then circled it. Her first step. Within an hour, she was sitting in her car, driving toward the city. The closer she got, the steadier she felt. The building was tall, glass-fronted, and quiet inside. She approached the reception desk,
and asked for an attorney whose name appeared in several of the documents.
When the attorney entered the room, he froze for a moment. She noticed it. His eyes flicked to her, then to the folder she held. Evelyn sat straight, her hands resting calmly on her lap. "I need to know why my name appears in documents you signed with my husband," she said gently. Her tone was soft, but the firmness beneath it was unmistakable. The attorney swallowed. "Mrs. Hart, I wasn't expecting—" "I know," she said, "but I'm here, and I want the truth." His shoulders lowered, and he motioned for her to sit. "I can't tell you everything," he said quietly, "but I can tell you your husband was involved in transactions that were unusual." Evelyn listened, taking mental notes. The details were vague, but the fear in his voice was real. She left with more questions than answers, but also with direction. She was not lost anymore. Her next stop was the address listed on the monthly payments. It led her to a small, modest house on the edge of town. She sat in her car for a moment before stepping out. Her heartbeat was steady. When she knocked, a woman in her late 50s opened the door. The woman's face went pale when she recognized Evelyn. "You're his wife," the woman whispered. "Yes," Evelyn said softly. "And I think it's time we talk." They sat in the living room. The woman's hands trembled slightly. She explained she had been receiving payments for years. She didn't say why. She didn't need to. Her eyes, her hesitation, her fear, all of it told Evelyn there was a story hidden beneath layers of guilt. Evelyn didn't press further. Not yet. She simply said, "Thank you for speaking with me," and left. Her third confrontation came quicker than she planned. She visited the bank listed in several documents, hoping to learn more about accounts connected to Robert. The manager hesitated at first, giving formal answers, but when Evelyn placed a copy of a document on the desk, the one with her maiden name, his expression changed. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. "From my husband's briefcase," she said. The manager leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Mrs. Hart, your husband wasn't who you think he was." The words hit her like a second collapse, but she didn't show it. She sat still, her face calm, her voice steady. "Then tell me who he was." The manager looked around nervously. "I can't say much, but someone has been trying to access these accounts illegally, and your maiden name may have been used for something." Evelyn breathed in slowly. She didn't panic. She simply nodded and stood. "Thank you. That's all I needed for now." By the time she returned home, the sun was beginning to set. The sky was warm with orange light, and the house felt different, less like a place where lies had lived, and more like a place where truth was finally being uncovered. She placed the documents back into the briefcase, but she didn't close it. She wasn't finished. She sat with her notebook again, writing everything she had learned. The lawyer's hesitation, the woman's guilt, the banker's fear. All of it pointed to one thing. Robert had been living a separate life long before he met her, and that life had threads tangled through hers without her knowing. Evelyn didn't cry. She didn't shake. The hurt was still there, but it no longer controlled her. Instead, she felt something stronger, a quiet determination that settled deep inside her. She had spent 17 years being kept in the dark. Now she was ready to bring everything into the light. She picked up the phone and made another call, this time to someone whose name appeared across many documents. Someone connected to Robert's past. Someone who would not expect her. As the phone rang, Evelyn felt her new strength settle fully into place. The call was answered on the fourth ring. A low voice came through, cautious and unsure. Evelyn introduced herself calmly, giving only her name and nothing more. The silence that followed told her everything. This person knew exactly who she was. "I don't think we should speak on the phone," the voice finally said. "Then we can meet," Evelyn replied. "Tomorrow morning, at the cafe near the old train station." There was another pause, heavier this time. "Fine," the person said, "but come alone." Evelyn agreed. The next morning she arrived early. The cafe was nearly empty, the air still cool with the scent of fresh bread. She chose a table near the window and waited. When the door opened, the person from the phone stepped inside, a man in his 60s, wearing a worn jacket and carrying an expression filled with complicated emotions. Regret, fear, and something else she couldn't name. He sat down slowly. "You shouldn't be digging into this," he murmured, "but you already know that." Evelyn met his eyes. "I deserve the truth." He looked down at his hands, then back at her. "Your husband was involved in things before he met you, things that never really ended." He explained pieces, careful not to reveal too much, but every detail he shared confirmed what Evelyn had already felt in her bones. Robert's history was not separate from her life. It had been wrapped around her without her seeing it. When Evelyn left the cafe, the morning sun was brighter, but her path ahead felt clearer still. She returned home and placed her notes in neat stacks. This was no longer a puzzle she feared. It was a truth she intended to finish assembling. She stood in the center of her living room, breathing slowly, letting the weight of her new purpose settle fully into her. Every step she took now carried a power, a strength shaped by truth rather than fear, guiding her toward answers she would no longer run from. She was ready, and nothing, not even the past Robert tried to bury, would stop her now. "I used to think truth arrived like lightning, sudden and loud. But when it finally came for me, it moved more like morning fog. It slipped into rooms quietly, wrapped around people I thought I knew, and showed me shapes that had always been there." It began with a phone call from the hospital. I was standing at the sink again, the same place where I had first heard Robert fall. This time the nurse's voice sounded careful. "Mrs. Hart," she said, "your husband is awake." Those 4 words felt heavier than any others I had heard in weeks. My hand tightened around the edge of the counter. A part of me had thought he might never wake, that I would be left holding questions with no one to answer. But now, the man who had woven these secrets together was breathing, speaking, alive. And I was no longer the woman who stayed silent. When I entered his room, the machines were still there, but his eyes were open. They followed me slowly as I walked toward him. He looked smaller, older, like the lies had drained something from him. "Evelyn," he whispered. I pulled the chair closer but did not touch his hand. "You left your briefcase at home," I said quietly. His eyes closed for a moment, as if the word itself hurt. When he opened them again, fear flickered there, mixed with something like defeat. "You opened it," he said. It was not a question. I did not answer. He studied my face, searching for softness, for the woman who had always given him the benefit of the doubt. She was gone. In her place was someone else, calm, steady, and done with not knowing. "There are people who will be angry if you start asking questions," he murmured. "There are people who should be glad I'm not doing more than that," I replied. The silence between us stretched. Then he turned his head away. "It was never supposed to touch you," he said. "It already did," I answered. "You just never looked closely enough to see it." I left the hospital with no apology, no confession, nothing but a handful of half-truths that confirmed what I already knew. He had built this life on secrets, and he had hoped I would remain one of them, unaware, quiet, harmless. But I was not quiet anymore. In the following days, things began to move faster than I had imagined. The lawyer I had visited called me back, his tone sharpened by urgency. "Mrs. Hart," he said, "someone has been asking about your husband's files, someone other than you." The bank manager called too. "We've frozen certain accounts," he explained. "There are irregular activities and your name appears in places it never should have." Even the woman who had been receiving payments asked to see me again. We met in the same small living room, but this time her eyes could not meet mine. "They called me," she said, wringing her hands. "They told me not to speak to you again. They said I'd regret it." Her voice broke. "I already regret everything." It all came to a head in a small conference room at the hospital.
A family meeting, they called it, though there was very little family feeling in the air. The hospital administrator was there. So was the social worker who had told me about the envelope. The lawyer sat at one end of the table. The bank manager sat at the other. And beside me, in a wheelchair, was Robert, his face drawn and tired, but his eyes still sharp. The briefcase sat on the table between us, closed, but no longer mysterious. It was no longer a symbol of curiosity, but of consequence.
"We need to discuss certain documents," the administrator began. "There are legal, financial, and ethical concerns that affect this hospital, Mr. Hart's business dealings, and you, Mrs. Hart." I said nothing. I only looked at Robert. His eyes did not meet mine. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Some contracts were signed under identities that may not have been entirely accurate," he said. "Funds were moved in ways that could be seen as fraudulent." "Could be," the bank manager snapped. "Look at the transfer histories. Look at the dates. Look at whose name was used." He slid a file across the table. Inside, I saw my maiden name over and over again, attached to things I had never seen, decisions I had never made. The social worker spoke softly. "When your husband was brought in, Mrs. Hart, there were concerns about who might be liable for his care, his debts, his assets. That's why I mentioned the envelope. I thought you knew. When I realized you didn't..." She shook her head. "It didn't feel right. I should have felt overwhelmed, but instead I felt clear. The room was full of people who had known pieces of my husband's shadow life. Some had helped him. Some had benefited. Some had looked away. And now all of them were forced to sit across from the woman he had kept in the dark." Robert finally spoke. His voice was thin but sharp. "Evelyn had nothing to do with any of this. Leave her out of it." I turned to him then, my calm holding steady. "You used my name," I said. "My life, my trust. You brought me into it without asking." I met his eyes fully. "You don't get to decide when I'm in it anymore." The words settled in the room like a verdict. No one rushed to defend him. The lawyer looked down at his hands. The bank manager sighed. The administrator spoke about investigations, audits, legal actions. The words washed over me like distant waves. I heard them, but they did not scare me. I was no longer the most vulnerable person in the room. I was the only one with nothing left to hide. When the meeting ended, people left in different directions, each one carrying their own quiet fear. The truth was no longer a secret. It was a spreading stain, and all of them were standing in it. Later that evening, I stood alone outside the hospital, the sky dimming into a soft grey blue. I thought about the briefcase, now in the hands of people who would pull it apart piece by piece, not to protect Robert, but to protect themselves. For years, that briefcase had been an object of mystery, something I told myself I didn't need to understand. Now it was evidence, proof. A mirror his world could no longer avoid. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I did not feel victorious. This was not the kind of story where revenge tasted sweet. It tasted like ash and old paper and the end of an illusion. But inside that taste, there was something else too, freedom. For the first time in 17 years, I was not living around a secret. I was walking past it, through it, beyond it. For the first time, I felt lighter, and whatever came next would belong to me. The house felt different the morning after everything came into the open. Not lighter or happier, but clearer, like a window finally washed after years of dust settling quietly over it. I walked through each room slowly, letting my fingers brush the furniture, the walls, the frames. Nothing had moved, yet everything felt rearranged. The silence didn't scare me anymore. It felt honest for the first time in a long while, as if the house itself had been waiting for someone to finally speak the truth aloud. I paused in the living room, where the soft morning light touched the old rug. This was the room where so many small moments had passed unnoticed. Quiet dinners, quiet evenings, quiet birthdays. I once believed quiet meant peace. Now I understood it could also mean distance. It could mean loneliness hidden beneath polite smiles. It could mean a life lived beside someone who never truly let you in. I sat on the couch and allowed myself to feel all of that, not with anger anymore, but with acceptance. Acceptance is softer than forgiveness, but it still makes space for breathing. In the kitchen, the briefcase sat where I left it, closed but no longer threatening. I reached for it gently. Its weight was the same, but what it represented had changed. It was no longer a door to secrets. It was a chapter that had ended. I opened it one last time, not to read or search, but to make sure I wasn't afraid of it anymore. The papers were still there, the envelope, the documents filled with names and places that shaped a life I never knew existed. But none of it controlled me now. I closed the briefcase slowly and locked it. The click of the lock felt like a breath releasing from deep inside my chest. I placed it on the top shelf of the hallway closet, high enough to be out of sight but not hidden. I didn't want to bury the truth. I only wanted it to rest. Later that afternoon, my sister came to visit. She stepped inside and studied my face with the kind of tenderness only a sibling can offer. "You look different," she said softly. "I feel different," I answered. We sat at the table drinking tea the way we used to when we were younger. I told her pieces of what happened, not the darkest parts, not the painful details, but enough for her to understand the shape of it. She didn't interrupt, she didn't offer advice, she simply listened. When I finished, she reached across the table and held my hand. "You're stronger than you think, Eve," she whispered. It was the first time in days I felt warmth settle in my chest, like a small flame learning how to grow again. That night, I stepped into my small pottery room for the first time in weeks. Dust had settled on the shelves. My tools lay untouched. I ran my hand along the table and felt something warm rise in me. Creating had always been my way of breathing. Somewhere along the years I let it shrink into a hobby. Now it felt like a path back to myself. I opened the window, letting fresh air fill the room, and sat at the wheel. The clay felt cool and steady beneath my fingers. As it turned, shaping itself slowly, I felt my thoughts turning too, shaping into something calmer, something whole. In the days that followed, I made small changes. I moved Robert's slippers into a box. I folded his shirts and placed them in the back of the closet. I left his books on the shelf, not out of sentiment, but out of respect for the years we did share. The dinners, the soft mornings, the laughter that was real, even if the truth was not. Healing did not mean erasing everything. It meant choosing which pieces to carry forward, and which to finally release without guilt. One morning I walked outside to tend the garden. The flowers looked brighter than I remembered. My hands moved through the soil with a gentleness I had forgotten. I planted new seeds, letting the quiet rhythm of the work settle my thoughts. As I watered the ground, I realized I wasn't rebuilding a life. I was discovering one I had quietly abandoned while trying to hold a marriage together. Each small action felt like a step toward myself. There were moments of sadness, of course, memories that returned with a sting, nights when the house felt too big, mornings when I reached for a second coffee cup before remembering I didn't need one. But each time the ache rose, so did something else, a quiet strength reminding me I had survived storms in silence. Now I was facing this one with open eyes, open hands, and a heart learning to steady itself again. A few days later, I returned to the hospital, not for answers or closure, but for myself. Robert looked smaller, tired, almost transparent. He opened his eyes when he heard me enter. "I didn't expect you," he whispered. "I didn't come for you," I replied gently. "I came for myself." He nodded slowly, his eyes drifting away. There was no anger left between us, only truth and distance. I stayed for a few minutes, long enough to make peace with the past, then stood to leave. As I reached the doorway, he spoke again. "Evelyn, I'm sorry." I paused but didn't turn back. "I know," I said. Then I stepped into the hallway, feeling something settle inside me like dust finally reaching the ground. That evening I sat on the porch watching the sky fade into soft gold. The air was still, the world quiet. But this quiet was different. It wasn't built on secrets or silence. It was mine. My own kind of peace, shaped slowly and honestly. The house behind me felt like it was breathing again, and maybe, in a way, so was I. In the weeks that followed, I learned that healing is not a straight line. It moves gently, then suddenly, then slowly again. Some mornings I woke with a calm heart, ready to step into a new day. Other mornings, memories drifted in like low clouds, reminding me that even truth carries its own kind of weight. But I no longer feared the weight. I carried it with steady hands, knowing it belonged to a life I had lived with honesty, even if someone else had not. Living honestly, I realized, is its own form of strength. I spent more time on the porch, watching the world around me move in small, quiet ways. Birds landing on the fence, leaves shifting in the wind, neighbors walking their dogs, simple things I had not noticed before, things I had rushed past without meaning to. Maybe I had been too busy holding together a life that was already cracked. Now, with the truth out in the open, I finally had room to breathe, and breathing felt like the beginning of everything. There were moments when I wondered who I might have been if I had known the truth earlier, if I had asked more questions, if I had listened to the small voice inside me that whispered when something felt wrong. But I did not let regret take root. Regret looks backward. I was learning to look forward, to the quiet edges of a life waiting for me to step into it fully. A life shaped not by secrecy but by choice. A life that allowed me to grow without fear of what I might discover. I cleaned the house slowly, room by room, not to erase the past, but to reclaim the space. Every drawer I organized, every corner I dusted, every shelf I touched, became a reminder that my home did not belong to a story hidden in a briefcase. It belonged to me. I lit candles in the evenings, soft, warm ones that filled the rooms with light instead of shadows. The house felt different, almost like it was learning to breathe again, just as I was. There was a new stillness in it, gentle, steady, honest. Sometimes I thought about Robert, not with anger, not with love, but with a kind of quiet distance. People are complicated. They carry stories they don't share, fears they don't voice, choices they don't explain. I no longer needed to understand all of his reasons. Understanding them would not change what had happened. And forgiveness, I realized, is not something owed. It is something chosen when the heart feels ready. Mine was still finding its way. I allowed myself patience, a kindness I rarely gave myself before. One afternoon I returned to my pottery wheel. The clay spun beneath my hands, soft and cool. As I shaped it, I felt something shift in me, something steady. Creation has a way of reminding us that life can be rebuilt, reshaped, renewed. Every curve, every line, every small adjustment became a quiet promise to myself. I would keep moving, keep growing, keep learning who I was beyond the years I had spent in someone else's shadow. I was no longer hiding behind silence. I was stepping into my own light. I also began taking walks in the early evening. The world felt different at that hour, calm, slightly golden, filled with a kind of gentle truth. I watched families on their porches, children on bicycles, couples walking hand in hand. Life was still happening everywhere, and I was finally part of it again, not just watching through a window of silence. Walking reminded me that the world was wider than my past. It stretched forward, open and full of possibility. Each step felt like a soft returning, a quiet homecoming. Some nights I sat with a cup of tea and let my thoughts wander to the briefcase stored in the closet. Not with fear, not with dread, but with a strange peace. The truth inside it had once shaken my world. Now it simply existed, like an old photograph tucked away. Important, yes, but no longer powerful enough to hold me in place. The truth had been revealed, and with it came an unexpected gift: clarity. Clarity about who I was, what I valued, and where I wanted my life to go next. Healing, I learned, is not about forgetting. It is about choosing what to carry. I carried the lessons. I carried the strength. I carried the knowledge that I could survive something I never imagined facing, and slowly, gently, I let go of the rest. Letting go was not a moment but a practice, one I returned to each day with softer hands. As the days passed, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in years: myself, my real self. Not the quiet wife who tiptoed around closed doors, not the woman who accepted silence as love, but the woman who could sit alone in her home, surrounded by truth, and still feel whole. Whole, not because everything was perfect, but because nothing was hidden anymore. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, I closed my eyes and breathed in the soft air. The world felt steady, peaceful, and in that moment I understood something important. The truth does not come to destroy us, it comes to free us, even if the freedom arrives with a sting. The truth had torn apart the life I thought I had, but it had given me back something far greater, myself. Sometimes the person we sleep beside is a stranger we never truly meet, but sometimes losing them is how we finally meet ourselves. If you found the truth, would you open it?